Well, at the beginning of the semester, we began, you remember, by investigating subatomic particles, and then we moved up a level of organization to atoms, and then we moved up another level of organization to molecules, and then we moved up another level of organization to cells. And we spent a long time this semester looking at cells, what their functions are, what their shapes are, what they do, different metabolic activities that occur inside cells, etc. And we're finally ready now to move on and talk about the next higher level of complexity with relationship to living organisms. And that level of complexity is called tissues. And first things first, before we start talking about the different types of tissues, I need to give you a definition of what a tissue is in the first place. A tissue is basically a collection of cells that function together to perform some particular task for the body. And there are four general types of tissue in the body. Okay, you might think that there's lots of different types of tissue, and there are, but all of the different types of tissues we find fit into one or four categories. And those four categories of tissue are epithelial tissue. That's things that make up the linings, like the lining of your stomach or the surface of your skin. Anything that faces an opening. That opening could be an internal opening, that opening could be an external opening. Then there's connective tissue, which is very commonly found throughout the body. Connective tissue includes things like your cartilage, ligaments, tendons, the dermis, which is the layer of tissue right under your epidermis, bone, blood. Okay, so there's lots of different types of connective tissue. Muscular tissue, I'm sure you're familiar with. That's the types of tissue that has the ability to contract or shorten. And finally, nervous tissue, the kind of tissue we use to send signals around the body very rapidly. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the major characteristics and qualities that are true for each of the different types of tissue. We're going to start with epithelial tissue, and I'm going to talk to you about what are the basic features of epithelial tissue that we always see. And the first thing is that all epithelial tissue is highly cell-rich. And what that really means is that cells that make up an epithelium are always very tightly packed together. Very, very tightly. So as a result of that, of all these cells being packed so tightly together, there is very, very little room for anything else. And as a result, epithelial tissue is avascular. That means it has no blood vessels present. So the question becomes, well, if there are no blood vessels present in epithelial tissue, how do the living cells in epithelial tissue survive? Where do they get their nutrients? How do they get oxygen? What do they do to get rid of waste products and carbon dioxide? The answer is that immediately underlying any epithelial tissue, you will always see a layer of connective tissue. And the connective tissue always has, at least the connective tissue that's under epithelial tissue, always has blood vessels in it, and those blood vessels function to supply the overlying epithelial tissue with the nutrients and oxygen the cells there need. At the juncture between the epithelial tissue and the connective tissue underneath, there is a collection of molecules that serve almost like a glue to anchor the epithelial cells to the underlying connective tissue. And that layer of molecules, that layer of glue, is called the basement membrane. Now there's one other key feature of all epithelial tissue. By definition, epithelial tissue always opens towards some sort of opening. It might be the outside of your body, or if you're looking at your stomach, it might be the opening of your stomach to the interior, but there is always an opening. Let's take a cross section of a blood vessel, for example. If this is my blood vessel in cross section, say it's an artery, the innermost lining, of that blood vessel will be made of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue always faces an opening, and the opening is always called the lumen. Now notice that on the outside of every single blood vessel too, because there's an outer edge to it that faces some other opening, there will be epithelial tissue there as well. So by rule, epithelial tissue always faces an opening, and because of that, epithelial tissue has a quality to it that we do not see in other types of tissue, and that is the quality of polarity. Now you'll remember near the beginning of the semester, we talked about the term polarity, but there we use the term polarity to refer to things like partial positive and negative charges, such as we saw in water. That's one definition of polarity. This is a different definition of polarity. Excuse me. This definition of polarity relates to if I have multiple layers of cells, or even if I have a single layer of epithelial cells. One side of the cell is closest to the lumen. We call that side the apical side of the cell. Sometimes you'll see some books call it the luminal side, which probably makes more sense, but it's a less commonly used term. And there's always one side of the cell that faces closest to the basement membrane side. We call that side of the cell the basal side of the cell. So that's polarity as it relates to epithelial cells, and it's a direct result of epithelial cells always facing some sort of lumen or opening. Epithelial cells within epithelial tissue come in three basic shapes. We have what are called cuboidal cells, and they are about as tall as they are wide, generally speaking. We have columnar cells, which are always taller than they are wide. And then we have squamous cells. And squamous cells, when you look at them from the side, will look almost like a fried egg. The nucleus kind of sticks up like the yolk of an egg would, and they tend to have a very flattened appearance. If you look at them over top, they look like a fried egg when you're looking at them down in a pan. Those are called squamous cells. Now, within the category of epithelial tissue, there are different types of epithelial tissue. The first major distinction we can make among epithelial tissues is that tissue made up of a single layer of epithelial cells? If it is, we call it simple epithelium. If, on the other hand, the epithelium is made up of multiple layers of epithelial cells stacked one on top of each other, then we have what's called stratified epithelium. And the functions of simple epithelium versus stratified epithelium go hand in hand with their appearance. The stratified epithelium is really good at things like protection. Okay, having lots of thick layers means that if a few cells get damaged or sloughed off or rubbed off, it's not a big deal for the body because there's plenty more layers of epithelial cells underneath the ones that were lost. On the other hand, simple epithelium is much better at things like diffusion, the movement of things across a plasma membrane. They're also good at absorption and secretion. So stratified, you're good at protection because you're really thick. Simple, you're good at things like diffusion, absorption, and secretion if you're really thin. Now this picture here, by the way, is showing you a layer of simple squamous epithelial cells, and I hope you can see from that picture that those cells, looking at them from above, do indeed look like a bunch of fried eggs side by side in a pan. There's also another type of epithelial tissue called glandular epithelial tissue, and as the name implies, this is epithelial tissue associated with glands, such as sweat glands, for example. There are two main classes of glandular tissue. There's exocrine glandular tissue and endocrine glandular tissue. Endocrine glandular tissue is any tissue that manufactures hormones, and those hormones are secreted into the surrounding area, and eventually they enter into the blood. By comparison, exocrine glandular tissue is tissue which manufactures a product that is secreted into some sort of opening or lumen. So for example, a sweat gland manufactures a product. It's actually a filtrate from blood plasma, and we call it sweat. But that sweat is then not secreted into the bloodstream, like is the case with endocrine glands, but rather that sweat is secreted into an opening that makes its way to the surface of the skin where it's released. The next kind of tissue I want to talk about briefly is connective tissue, and you will remember that connective tissue is always found immediately under epithelial tissue because the connective tissue has blood vessels in it and it feeds or supplies nutrients to the overlying epithelial tissue. Because we need to have room for things like blood vessels and immune system cells and fibrous proteins for strength, connective tissue does not have very many cells in it. It tends to be what we call cell poor. Not very many cells present. Oops. And that cell poor nature means that we got to have something else that fills up the majority of the space. If I don't have a lot of cells, well, what do I have? The answer is you have this thing called a matrix. Connective tissue is always made up of cells and a matrix that surrounds the cells. That matrix is manufactured by the cells, and it can include such things as collagen fibers, which are protein fibers that lend strength to the connective tissue. It often consists of elastin fibers, which have the ability to stretch and recoil after being stretched, and also reticular fibers, which can be used, for example, as a sort of mesh-like network for filtration purposes, as we see in the spleen. As I said again, connective tissue is highly vascular. Oh, there's one other thing that's also present in the matrix that I didn't mention here, and that's the gel component. In addition to all of these different types of fibrous proteins, there's a gel component. Some books call it the ground substance, as you see in this picture here. And it's just like it can be almost fluid-like, it can be jelly-like. In the case of bone, it's very hard and mineralized. In the case of blood, it's a fluid called plasma. It can vary and be it can be liquid or solid. It depends on the type of connective tissue you're looking at. But that ground substance or gel component is the other major component of the matrix. So the matrix consists of fibrous proteins or structural proteins and some sort of a gel or ground substance. One thing you'll notice frequently when we discuss connective tissue is that the names of the cells that are found in the tissue is dependent on the type of tissue it is, and the names will always end in either the term site, that means it's a mature cell, or blast. Blast is used to refer to an immature cell. So for example, if we're looking at bone tissue, osteo is the prefix we use to refer to bone. An osteocyte would be a mature bone cell. An osteoblast would be an immature bone cell. If we were talking about cartilage, chondro, C-H-O-N-D-R-O, is the prefix we use to refer to cartilage. So a chondrocyte would be a mature cartilage cell. A chondroblast would be an immature one. Now there are lots of different types of connective tissue. I'm only going to briefly touch on them here. And there's some nice pictures in your book that you can look at to see different microscopic slides of tissues. A common type of connective tissue everybody's familiar with is adipose tissue. Another name for adipose tissue is fat tissue. Here's a picture of a slide of fat tissue, and you can see each individual cell almost looks like it's empty, but it's not. This whole area in here is all lipids. And in fact, there's so many lipids that it has completely displaced all the organelles, including the nucleus, off to one side of the cell. That's adipose tissue. That's one type of connective tissue. There's another class of connective tissue that involves a bunch of different types of tissue called loose connective tissue proper. And loose connective tissue proper is, as it says, the name implies, it has a very loose or open matrix, so there's plenty of room for things like blood vessels. We commonly see loose connective tissues immediately under epithelial tissue because this loose connective tissue supplies the epithelium with nutrients and oxygen. And the cells in loose connective tissue always have the precursor fibro, so it'll be a fibroblast or a fibrocyte. Dense connective tissue proper is very similar to loose. The difference being is that dense connective tissue proper has a really high fibrous protein component, whereas the loose connective tissue had a really high gel component. And because the dense connective tissue proper has a really high fibrous protein component, it tends to be really strong and makes up things like ligaments and tendons. It too has the fibro prefix on the names of cells: fibroblast, fibrocyte. Cartilage is yet another type of connective tissue. And in cartilage, again, we said the word chondro is a prefix we use to refer to cells in that tissue. And cells in cartilage, when they manufacture the matrix that surrounds them, that matrix solidifies into a very relatively hard substance. It's what we call gristle. If you're eating a chicken leg or something, the gristle you encounter, that's cartilage, and it has a pretty hard texture to it. Because the cells get trapped in that pretty hard matrix, they get trapped in almost like a little bubble inside that matrix. So here's the edge of the matrix, and the cell is trapped inside of it. That space that the cell is trapped in, right here, is called the lacuna. The term, by the way, lacuna, means little lake. It's like the cell is housed in a little lake. Lacunae is plural for lacuna, just so you know. I cleared a bunch of stuff off the screen. It was starting to get too messy, just so you know. The next type of connective tissue up is bone tissue. And bone tissue, we refer to cells in bone tissue as either osteoblasts or osteocytes. Here's a picture of a slide of compact bone tissue. We'll be learning more about that in A&P 1 and 2, mostly 1. The main difference with bone tissue is that the matrix the cells secrete is a very tough and hard matrix made of calcium and phosphate salts. And just as with cartilage, cells in bone tissue do indeed secrete a matrix and then become trapped in it, so they too also have lacunae, for plural, in which the houses are celled. Which the cells are housed. Okay, last type of connective tissue on this slide we're going to talk about is blood. And blood is a type of connective tissue, and that often surprises people, but it is a type of connective tissue because it meets the requirements of being a connective tissue. It's relatively cell poor. Okay, there's not a tremendous number of cells, for example, when you compare it to something like epithelial tissue. It has a matrix in it. In this case, the matrix has fibrous proteins, such as fibrin, and it also has a large gel component to the matrix, and that gel component is highly liquid. In this case, we call that gel component the blood plasma. There are different types of cells found in blood, the most common of which are erythrocytes. Erythro means red, and cyte, of course, means mature cell. There are also leukocytes. Leuko means white, so a leukocyte is a white blood cell. And there are also these things called platelets, which in and of themselves are not true cells, but rather these are little pieces and parts of much larger cells that are broken off and released into the bloodstream to help with clotting. Okay, very briefly I'm going to talk to you about muscle tissue next. This is the third of the 4 different types of tissue that we're going to be learning about. Muscular tissue is composed of cells which have the ability to respond to a stimulus, and the way in which they respond to a stimulus is by shortening or contracting. When we refer to a mature cell in muscle tissue, we call it a myocyte. When we refer to an immature cell in muscular tissue, we refer to it as a myoblast. And there are 3 different types of muscular tissue, and 3 only. They include skeletal muscle tissue. That's the kind of tissue that makes up the muscles that you usually try to get larger when you work out lifting weights. So things like your biceps, your triceps, your trapezius muscle, your all of the muscles in your legs, such as your hamstrings, what we call the hamstrings. Those are all examples of skeletal muscle. And skeletal muscle is what we call voluntary muscle tissue. And that simply means that we have conscious control over the contraction of those muscles. When I want to move my arm, I think about moving it and it happens. Okay, I'm consciously controlling the movement of the arm. By comparison, the other two types of muscular tissue are both what we call involuntary muscle tissue, which means we do not have to consciously think about contracting them in order for them to contract. And these two classes include cardiac muscle tissue, which is found in only one place in the body, and that is the heart. And a good thing, too, that it's not voluntary, because otherwise we would never be able to fall asleep, because once we fell asleep, we wouldn't be able to think about beating our heart. And the other kind of involuntary muscle tissue is what's called smooth muscle tissue, and this is found in lots of places in the body. For example, all the muscle tissue that's found lining your digestive tract and your blood vessels are smooth muscle tissue. The muscle tissue found in the uterus, for example, that contracts during childbirth is smooth muscle tissue. The last type of tissue we're going to talk about very briefly is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is like muscular tissue in that the cells that make up nervous tissue also have the ability to respond to a stimulus. In the case of nervous tissue, cells respond to a stimulus not by contracting like muscle tissue did, but rather by sending out electric signals and these chemicals called neurotransmitters to communicate with other nervous cells or to communicate with other types of tissues. Again, next semester we'll learn lots more about this. For now, you just need to know that in nervous tissue there are two general classes of cells found within it. There are what are called neurons. These are the cells that actually receive signals and send out signals. And the other type of cell is called a neuroglia cell. And neuroglia cells are support cells. They serve the purpose of making sure that the neurons have sufficient nutrients, that cellular debris and metabolic waste products are cleared away. They basically do everything that's needed to keep the neurons happy so that the neurons only have to worry about receiving signals and sending signals out. The neuroglia take care of everything else. For every about 9 neuroglia, you have 1 neuron. So the neuroglia vastly outnumber the number of neurons in the body. The neurons are much larger than the neuroglia, though, so they're usually what you see more readily when you look at nervous tissue under the microscope. I'll talk about 3 key features of a neuron that you should know real quick. This is a picture of a neuron over here, and you'll notice it has a very large cell body, or what is called the soma. Soma means body, and that's where the nucleus is located. It also has a number of branch-like projections that you can see here that I'm circling. Those are called the dendrites. Dendrite means branch. So these are the branches, and this is where we get incoming information. Signals and information from the environment or from neighboring neurons comes in along the dendrites towards the cell body or the soma. And then when an outgoing signal is deemed necessary by the neuron, that outgoing signal travels along a very long a very long single branch projection, which is called the axon. This is the way information heads out of the neuron and onto either another neuron or maybe a muscle cell or a gland, whatever it might be. All right, that's it for tissues. Next up, we're going to be talking about some different cavities in the body and placement of organs.